They called it a harmless maze until Ranger dug up a folded flag and a dog tag this town had buried to hide its own guilt. The crowd clapped for the harvest parade, but not for the man with the black dog. Beneath bunting and brass music, the cheers sounded practiced, bright enough to wash a town clean, until Elliot Kane and his Labrador Ranger stepped into the light and reminded everyone what couldn't be rinsed away. Hollow Creek wore late autumn like a costume, the sky a flawless blue and the air sweet with kettle corn and cider. But the ground told a different story. This field had grown more than corn. It had grown the kind of roots that wrapped around ankles and pulled men backward. Elliot moved through the rows of booths as if he were walking upstream. He was a familiar stranger, local enough for people to know his family name, distant enough for them to remember why his welcome always felt conditional. Ranger kept to his heel, ears alert, black coat catching the sun like polished stone. Children pointed, and a hush followed, a ripple that pretended to be curiosity while curdling into judgment. Their parents smiled the way people do when they want to redirect a river without admitting it exists. The festival crowned itself with a spectacle the town called heritage, the Scarecrow Maze, a labyrinth of corn and straw sculptures that twisted across the old plantation grounds. Signs leaned into tradition with careful language: home, harvest, heartland, never the word that made people flinch. The maze rose taller than the tents and rides, its entry framed by two scarecrows in faded overalls and stiff gloves posed in a parody of welcome. Elliot paused at the fence and scanned the line of figures standing sentry along the path. The stitches on their faces puckered into smiles that didn't belong to joy. One wore a tattered army jacket, the sleeve hanging open where a patch should sit. The patch was there, barely clinging, his division's insignia, the kind that lived in memory long after fabric gave up. Ranger's rumble was low enough to feel rather than hear. The breeze shifted and carried a smell that didn't belong to fairs, wet straw and cooled smoke, as if a burn pit no one remembered still breathed under the soil. The scent pressed on Elliot's ribs and pushed a shape forward he refused to name. Across the loudspeakers, the mayor's voice broke the air with practiced warmth, calling for brave hearts to take the maze before sunset. A game for families? A tradition for those who believed in good stories told the safe way. Applause rose like confetti, then scattered into chatter. Elliot's hands were steady, but a small tightness climbed from his forearms to his throat, threading past the places where breath had learned to hold itself. He signed up without thinking about the prize, because this kind of pull wasn't about money. It was the feeling a soldier gets when a map lines up too neatly with the landscape in front of him. The moment when coincidence stops being polite. The entry gate was a working farm door, weathered, imperfect, a splinter of past utility shoved into present entertainment. Shadows pooled beneath it, broken by the slats of amber light that slipped through the corn. Elliot stepped closer, and the crowd behind him thinned, as if some quiet agreement had been reached, and no one had told him the rules. Ranger's nails clicked softly against the packed dirt, a metronome keeping time with the drum inside Elliot's chest. On the other side of the fence, the scarecrows leaned at angles that felt intentional. Straw hands reached out with a gentleness that tried too hard. Burlap faces were stitched with care that bordered on reverence, as if the maker had been trying to fix expressions onto history rather than cloth. The jacketed figure bore a second detail he hadn't noticed at first. The seam at the collar bulged where extra stuffing had been pressed in, and the thread there looked new, fresh thread on something meant to be old. Elliot's attention sharpened, and the fair's separate world drifted farther away, sound receding into the kind of distance that turns voices into a hum. The sun tipped lower, turning the corn a deeper gold. Dust motes lifted in slow spirals, catching the light and falling back to the row where the first turn disappeared. Ranger leaned forward, testing the air, then glanced back as if asking a question he'd already answered. The dog's shoulder brushed Elliot's shin with the kind of weight that steadies men on narrow ledges. Loyalty has a way of stepping into a silence and making room for a man to breathe. A vendor's bell rang, thin and bright, and the moment snapped into shape. Elliot adjusted the strap on his bag with a familiar motion that passed through him like a reflex from the years when each adjustment meant staying ready. He marked the first landmarks without thinking. Knotted root at the post base, missing slat on the fence, a rusted nail head that could catch fabric if someone wasn't careful. His mind made a quiet list because order mattered, because order had once been the difference between a safe path and all the ways it could go wrong. He felt, too, how this place preferred its memories tidy and its myths useful. The line of contestants shuffled forward while vendors packed up their brightness and the ride spun down. The maze wanted dusk. It wanted the hour when colors lose their edges and truth looks more like a shadow than a shape. Elliot watched the light flatten, watched the face on the jacketed figure shift from grin to grimace and back again, not because it moved, but because the dark had begun to tell its own story. Ranger's tail had gone still. Stillness from a dog trained for storms is louder than thunder. The temperature dropped in a way that didn't match the forecast. A band of cooler air slipped across the path and settled near the gate as if something had opened, inviting the warm out and the cold in. Elliot stepped across the threshold and felt the difference climb his legs. The fair's sounds tightened to a thin strand behind him, and the space ahead widened as though it had been waiting for him to arrive. He glanced once at the dividing line between celebration and field and found it thinner than he expected. The kind of border that only exists if everyone agrees to pretend. He didn't look back again. The maze took him in the way old places do when they recognize a name, even if no one has said it out loud. Ranger moved in step, chest forward, eyes tracking the tiny changes that tell a body where to place its feet. The path curved left, then right, and the posts creaked as if they had learned a language made of weight and weather. Elliot registered the pattern the way a musician registers a key change, absorbed, adjusted, unafraid of the work the next measure will require. The jacketed Scarecrow stood at the first bend, closer now, its stitches casting small shadows like veins. A strand of thread had come loose at the corner of its mouth and lifted in the breeze before falling back into its seam. As he crossed the gate, the first Scarecrow turned slightly, its stitched grin bending in the wind as if alive. The ground was too soft, like it had been disturbed recently, as if something beneath it was still breathing. The moment Elliot crossed the first turn, the fair's applause thinned into a distant shimmer, then vanished altogether, leaving a hush that pressed against his ears. Rows of dried corn rose higher than his shoulders, rustling without wind, their husks whispering in a cadence that felt learned rather than natural. The path widened just enough for two, and Ranger held to his left, brushing his leg with a steadying presence. Each time the earth sloped or the light shifted, it should have been the sort of quiet that calms a man. Instead, it felt purposeful, a silence that arranged itself around him like a ritual. Ranger lowered his head and began to work the ground as if the soil were a story waiting to be read. The dog's breathing slowed into a pattern that Elliot recognized from nights when thunder rolled over the house and old memories tried to climb back inside. Tail down, shoulders tight, Ranger paused over a shallow mound, half hidden by straw. Even before the glint appeared, Elliot knew the earth here had been moved by human hands, not weather. He crouched, the damp coolness seeping through the fabric of his pants, and brushed the dirt aside with his fingertips until metal kissed his skin. The shape was familiar before the letters said it. A dog tag, edges flecked with rust, engraved with a name he had not said aloud in years. Raymond Holt. The name entered him like cold water, not violent but absolute, washing through the chambers he kept closed. Holt was the measure by which Elliot understood courage, the quiet kind that made other men braver just by being near. 100 images pressed forward to be seen and were held back by will alone. A convoy lit by an orange sky, boots leaving tracks in dust, a hand on his shoulder when the world went sideways. The report had written a clean story about enemy fire. The truth had been muddier, and the mire around it had hardened into something like permanence. Holt's sacrifice had been folded into official words that fit neatly on a line, while the space between those words carried everything the line refused to hold. Elliot felt the weight of the tag in his palm, heavier than its metal could explain. Beneath his knees the ground throbbed with a faint, unsteady pulse, the sensation subtle enough to doubt and steady enough to believe. It was as if the earth recognized the name he'd tried to bury inside himself and answered by rising to the surface. He slid the tag against his own, and the metal clicked with a small sound that traveled farther than it should have, threading through the stalks and returning as a soft echo. Ranger looked up at him, then back at the path, nose twitching toward a thinner corridor that hadn't existed a moment earlier. The corn had shifted to reveal a new passage, the rows bending as though something inside the maze preferred that he continue. The scarecrows lining the outer fence had been still when he entered. Here, deeper in, they stood alone at irregular intervals, each turned a few degrees as if listening. Burlap faces had been stitched with careful hands, but it was the shadows they cast that felt attentive. Light slipping between the husks painted their features with motion, and in the motion, Elliot thought he saw the effort of a town trying to hold a smile steady while its jaw ached from the strain. Some figures wore work shirts stained to the color of soil. Others bore scraps of uniform stripped of rank and context. On more than one, the straw had been dyed a deeper hue that time could not reach. It wasn't the gaurishness of spectacle. It was the accuracy of memory. He moved forward slowly, footfalls settling into the rhythm of the field. Where the path narrowed, cornstalks brushed his sleeves with the intimacy of a crowd that wasn't quite ready to speak. The air cooled in pockets, then warmed again near patches where the ground darkened, each shift a reminder that weather was only a small part of how a place decides to feel. He thought about the town's habit of looping the right stories, the ones that made the harvest seem like a family album, and how absence had always been a character in those celebrations, names unspoken, photographs lost, history edited for length. Ranger's shoulder nudged his knee, a quiet call to stay present. Loyalty in a dog is not a performance, it is a practice. Holding Holt's tag, Elliot traced the stamped letters with his thumb, the ridges catching like shallow scars. The connection between this metal and this soil didn't feel metaphorical. It felt logistical, like a map overlay that suddenly aligned. The maze's design had seemed playful from the road. Inside, its confidence revealed itself. This wasn't a toss of hay and twine. It had intent. Rows formed corridors that directed a man's attention where it needed to go, then narrowed just enough to make turning back harder than moving on. The sensation was not of being chased, but of being expected. A hush settled that wasn't silence. From far off, the faintest hum threaded the rows, not quite musical, more like breath caught between throat and air. Elliot tried to place it and could not, only knew that it carried the same worn patience as an old story told to a child who may or may not be ready to hear it. The smell of straw thickened, braided with the mineral damp of churned dirt. He caught, too, a sweetness he couldn't name, like fruit left to ripen in shade. Pleasant until the shadow itself asks why it was chosen. Ranger stopped again and faced left, where the corn thinned into a short straightaway. The posts there leaned inward, their angles creating a frame as deliberate as a doorway. Elliot stepped into it, the ground dipping slightly, the soft give underfoot more pronounced. He let his weight test it before trusting it, the way a man trained by uncertain terrain learns to measure with his body. The scarecrow at the bend ahead was smaller, set apart from the others by its scale and by a care in its construction that could not be dismissed as whimsy. The shape suggested a maker who had known the human form well enough to get the proportions right and had chosen, for reasons that weren't decorative, to make it young. He stopped 3 paces away and let the scene present itself without pulling conclusions forward too fast. The figure's right hand was missing at the wrist. Twine hung loose where something once held straw together. At its feet, a single shoe broke the neatness of the dirt, heel partly swallowed, toe canted toward the path, as if it had tried to follow and hadn't been allowed. Threads at the ankle had darkened to a color that didn't belong to dust or dye. At the end of the row stood a smaller scarecrow, child-sized, with one hand missing and a shoe half buried in the dirt. The scarecrow child wore a sign around its neck, Tommy Holt, 1965, 1973, and one of its shoes was soaked in dried blood. The words were plain and unadorned, the kind carved when there is no energy left for embellishment. Elliot felt the neatness of the dates first, how they bracketed a life small enough to fit on a wooden slat, and then the weight of the shoe, how it leaned into the soil as if time had pushed it there. The maze did not change its posture. The corn still stood, the air still shifted, but the world inside Elliot's chest took a step backward and refused to pretend this was decoration. He held still long enough to feel the temperature of the ground change. The soil in this pocket was colder than the rows behind. a dampness rising through the dirt with the persistence of memory that refuses to dry. Ranger drifted in slow circles around the figure, head low, breath measured, the practiced patience of a companion trained to recognize what cannot be fixed by speed. Each lap traced a quiet orbit of guardianship, as if the dog understood that respect sometimes looks like not crossing a line you cannot see. Elliot watched the pattern form and recognized the comfort in it, a map drawn by loyalty when no other map would do. The small straw body sat upright on a wooden stool, head tilted at an angle too deliberate for accident. Whoever constructed it knew proportion and restraint. There was no theatrical grin, no exaggerated pose, only a pose that echoed stillness in a way that made stillness feel like a choice. The twine at the neck was clean and tight, newer than the burlap it held. Along the torso, the stitching was careful, steady hands guiding thread through fabric the way a person might mend a shirt they intended for someone they loved. The care unsettled him more than any crude attempt at fear could have done. This was not a prank. This was attention. He let the names settle together, father and son, Raymond and Tommy, and felt the shape of the town's memory curve around them both. He remembered coming home to Hollow Creek and hearing how stories shifted in polite voices. People said tragedy as if it were weather, something that came through and moved on. Nothing intentional, nothing indictable. The summer, Tommy disappeared. Flyers hung for a week, then curled and fell. Some said the creek ran fast that year. Some said the roads weren't safe. Others said nothing at all. The shortest line between sorrow and convenience. Elliot had not been there to search. He had been elsewhere surviving. When he returned, the town had already decided how much they were willing to remember. Up close, the Scarecrow's arms had been bound behind the stool with barbed wire. The choice of material was precise, not sensational, a detail that did not announce itself until it snagged his eye and refused to let go. The wire bit lightly into the burlap, not cutting, but pressing just enough to say that restraint had been preferred over release. It gave the piece a quiet gravity that undid any pretense of festival craft. The shoe at the figure's foot leaned half-buried, leather darkened and cracked, the laces tied with a child's earnestness. The stain at the toe was not fresh. It was the color of time after it has done all the dulling it can do. A breeze threaded the corridor and carried with it notes that were barely melody, more like the outline of one. The sound rose and fell with the regularity of breath, an old tune worn thin by years of carrying more sorrow than a tune should have to hold. It carried the cadence of a lullaby that had traveled through generations, altered by mouths that had to sing quietly so as not to be heard by the wrong ears. Elliot listened without moving, letting it pass through rather than catching. It, the way a person lets certain truths move untangled because they do not belong to him to hold. Around them, the maze pressed inward without touching, the way rooms feel smaller when a difficult conversation is about to happen. Elliot's skin prickled, a warning that did not suggest danger so much as demand presence. Ranger took a half step back and stopped, choosing distance without surrender. The dog's restraint taught Elliot how to stand in the space without taking too much of it, how to witness without rearranging what he saw to make it easier to carry. He lowered his gaze to the tag in his hand, the one that belonged to Raymond, and let the edges bite against his skin until sensation anchored thought. He considered the arc that had brought him here, how a man becomes fluent in certain silences until they feel like a second language. In barracks and briefings, in parades and funerals, he had learned which truths were welcome and which would bend a room against him. He had learned to accept gratitude offered to the right uniform while watching a different uniform receive none. He had told himself that survival required choosing battles, and he had chosen the ones that kept him breathing. The cost of that arithmetic stood in front of him now, scaled to a child's height, named and dated, placed in a labyrinth built for family photographs. The air shifted again, warmer now, as if the field had inhaled and held its breath. Elliot felt the urge to straighten the sign, to adjust the tilt of the head, to do something small and human that acknowledged the care that had already been taken. He did not move. The maze seemed to prefer attention over action, and he recognized in that preference a lesson he had been slow to learn. Ranger's chest rose and fell against his leg, a steady rhythm that matched the cadence of the almost song drifting through the corn. The quiet shared between man and dog was not empty. It was work. Somewhere beyond this pocket, the path continued, and Elliot could sense the pull of it, a directional insistence as gentle as a hand on the shoulder. He understood that leaving this place did not end it. It only carried it forward into whatever waited next. He looked once more at the boy's sign, letting each character have its weight, not flattening the dates into a shorthand for loss, but reading them as a span that deserved to be counted slowly. The field felt closer now, not threatening, but watchful, as if measuring whether he would take what it offered and carry it responsibly. The Scarecrow's head turned slightly toward him, stitch line catching the light as it shifted, and the straw at its throat stirred with a breath that did not belong to weather. A thin exhalation rose from the figure, not speech but intention shaped into sound, delivering a single truth without asking for agreement. He never came home. The smell of smoke returned, not from fire, but from memory. It rose without warning, thin at first, then certain, threading the corn with a presence that didn't belong to weather or season. The maze softened at the edges, and in that blur, the rows unstitched from their tidy lines and reassembled into a place he knew too well. For a breath-long moment, Elliot saw not corn, but jungle, not straw, but flame, not scarecrows, but silhouettes held together by will and duty. Ranger barked once into the dark, a clean, anchoring sound that tethered him to the present without denying what the past insisted on showing. The transformation was not dramatic so much as inevitable, as if the field had been waiting for permission to reveal what lived beneath its neat design. The rustle of husk took on the rhythm of a rotor beat, not loud, not literal, just enough to make a body brace for vibrations that would never arrive. The ground underfoot changed character, softening into a spring that suggested runoff and ash, a texture that taught feet to test before they committed. Elliot felt his balance correct itself the way it had done 1,000 times. Subtle shifts, weight carried in the hips, eyes scanning for patterns where patterns could save a life. He remembered the ambush in pieces that never arranged into a single frame. The night had been too orange to call darkness, the kind of light that erases distance and replaces it with heat. He did not summon screams. He refused them. Instead, he let the contour arrive. The tilt of the road, the sudden wind that tasted of metal, the press of a hand on his collarbone pulling him toward ground and cover. Holt had been there with a steadiness that did not announce itself, a presence that made chaos choose a different path. Others had run, not out of malice, but out of training that forgot to include everyone. Holt had not run. The remembering stopped there, at the threshold where it always stopped, because beyond that line waited the facts no report had wanted. The rustling of dry corn became the language of a living battlefield, stitched with racism and regret, two threads that refused to separate, even when pulled hard. Elliot kept moving, not fast, not slow, collecting details the way a man collects evidence for himself when he knows no one else will. The air brightened and dimmed in pulses, as if a hidden light were testing its reach. Ranger stayed close, a compact gravity always locating him, eyes tracking his breath, not the illusions. The dog's nearness shaped the space into something passable, a corridor a man could walk through without fearing he'd drift off the edge of himself. Around them, the scarecrows changed clothes without moving. One wore half a field hand's work shirt stitched to half a soldier's jacket, the seam too clean to be accidental. Another carried a faded armband on one sleeve and a service ribbon on the other, both threadbare, both undeniable. It was a visual honesty the town had, never practiced in daylight, the lineage of labor and the lineage of service occupying one body, neither canceling the other, both demanding to be seen together. Faces remained burlap, but the set of their shoulders gained a knowledge straw shouldn't hold, a posture that suggested men who had been asked for everything and given more than anyone recorded. Elliot stumbled over a low mound disguised with a light scattering of stalks, the kind of careless cover that reveals more than it conceals. He steadied himself and swept aside the straw, fingers catching on stiff fabric that shouldn't have been there. A folded flag lay beneath, edges singed in an old, patient burn. He recognized it without needing the evidence. The weight, the crease, the reverence failing at the corners. This was the one intended for Holt's family, the one ceremony never touched because paperwork had cauterized the need for proof. He held it with the care that belongs to things too heavy for their size, and felt the certain wrongness of a flag that had learned heat but not honor. The wind shifted again, not a gust, but a decision, and the corn bent backward as if something enormous had exhaled from the center of the maze. Leaves lifted and settled in a synchronized ripple, a field-sized breath, undoing any pretense that this was merely architecture for laughter. The temperature swung, a gentle drop that placed cool along the back of his neck and warm along his forearms, a layering that taught the body to notice the difference between what threatens and what warns. He did not hurry. Haste felt like the wrong language here. He kept his eyes level and let the path come to him. Ranger's growl deepened into a tone Elliot had heard in storms and hospital corridors, a low, sustained note that braided caution with resolve. The air ahead shimmered, not heat mirage, not trick of light, but something like red surfacing through a thin membrane, the suggestion of a fire rising underground without the scorch or smoke. It colored the stalks without burning them, an illumination that spoke in hints and unfinished phrases. Elliot understood that the maze was not asking him to relive a night. It was asking him to see the thread that tied that night to this place, this soil, this habit of forgetting that spared the comfortable and erased the rest. He stood still long enough to let the shimmer pass through its cycle. When it dimmed, the field regained its ordinary palette, and the scarecrows resumed their silent assignment. He held the folded flag at his side, unwilling to return it to the dirt, unwilling to pretend it belonged anywhere but where it had always been meant to go. The quiet around him changed flavor, less accusation than expectation, the kind that meets a man halfway and waits to see whether he will keep walking. There was no need to rehearse regret. The maze had no use for performance. It required a simpler offering, acknowledgement. He took a single step and then another, and the field replied with a narrowing of space that felt like a nod. The rows angled toward a clearing that he had not seen before, an open oval where the ground lay flatter and the posts stood straighter, like a room set for a gathering that ended early. Here the breeze settled, and here the smell of smoke receded into memory again, leaving the air clean enough to taste the minerals in it. Elliot lifted his head and counted the figures around the oval, noting their arrangement, the way each faced not inward, not outward, but toward the spot where he stood, as if the center were defined by whoever was willing to stand there. He understood then that the maze had not been built to trap. It had been arranged to concentrate. Everything that mattered had been gathered here, not in objects alone, but in posture, in the angle of straw shoulders, in the evidence of hands that had chosen to render truth as carefully as others had chosen to mask it. He did not search for exits. The question of leaving had no meaning until the question of staying had been answered. He let Ranger move a half step ahead, granting the dog the small privilege of leading while the man followed, a reversal earned by years of devotion in rooms where breath was work. Every scarecrow's head turned toward him in unison, not a snap, not a theatrical jolt, but a calm, unanimous adjustment, an entire field deciding to pay attention. In the stillness that followed, the air arranged itself around a single sentence, not spoken, not heard, but known with the clarity of a verdict. He had taken Holt's honor. The first voice that spoke through the straw sounded exactly like his own. It didn't arrive as a sound at first, but as a shape forming inside his chest, the way a memory makes the ribs feel too tight for breath. The field listened to itself, and somewhere within that listening, his voice learned how to be many. Elliot stood at the center of the clearing, with Ranger braced at his side, and the maze arranged its attention as if a judgment were about to be handed down, without gavel or witness, only air and earth, and what a man admits to, when there is nowhere left to set the truth but in front of him. Whispers gathered from every direction, the corn speaking in a soft friction that mimicked fire without heat, a hush woven with the crackle of dry husks grazing one another. The sound did not startle. It accumulated, an atmosphere turning from weather into meaning. The scarecrows leaned by degrees, subtle enough that he might have doubted movement if their shadows hadn't lengthened with human certainty. elbows and shoulders stretching along the ground, as if bone lived beneath the twine. None jerked, none lurched. They simply altered their posture into the attentive curve of bodies that know they are owed an answer. The change brought no threat, only the kind of seriousness that removes pretense from a room and instructs everyone inside it to choose honesty over comfort. Ranger planted his front paws and squared his stance, a sentinel posture Elliot recognized from hospital nights and thunder seasons. The dog trembled in a contained way, not out of fear of whatever this was, but from the effort of holding a line in a place that had no edges. Loyalty has weight, and Ranger bore it with the dignity of a creature who understands duty without ever naming it. Elliot felt the familiar drag of his medals against his chest, heavier now than the metal could account for, as if each ribbon had accrued interest in a currency paid by other men. Borrowed valor pulls on the neck in ways that remind the wearer which debts remain open. He looked with the kind of attention that makes looking its own labor. Each figure wore a tag in some fashion, tied to a wrist, stitched into a collar, nailed to a post at the back of the neck. Each name carried the echo of a uniform and the hush around a ceremony that never occurred. The variety of details sharpened the point. This was not theatrical symmetry. It was a roll call refused by official rooms and taken up by a field that had run out of patience. He read what he could without cataloging, letting names pass through the mind the way a river carries silt, knowing that grasping at each one would not restore what omission had taken. Every name he saw belonged to a black soldier. The pattern did not need commentary to be clear. It required witness. The maze did not posture as haunted. It functioned as memory with structure, judgment without theatric. Nothing here asked him to be afraid. Everything asked him to be precise. The hush turned from sound into pressure, not on the skin, but in the spaces where a person constructs his reasons. Elliot recognized the craft of it, the way the path had condensed him into this open, circled place, the way light and shade struck faces to make stitches look like expression, the way air carried the suggestion of a heartbeat without ever producing a pulse. The arrangement treated him as someone capable of understanding what was being asked. Standing in that privilege removed any remaining argument for ignorance. He brought Holt's tag to his chest and pressed it flat where the sternum knows how to hold weight. The metal warmed quickly and then stung with a heat that felt less like burn than insistence, as if the name itself required a place to anchor more solidly than a pocket or a palm. The sensation did not injure. It clarified. He let it linger long enough to make contact a decision rather than a reflex. And in that duration, he allowed himself to see the straight line from one night's omission to a lifetime's distortion. How a single silence taught other silences how to behave. How a clean report cleared a table that still held the plates and cups of a meal no one admitted was served. The whispers braided tighter, strands of sound twining into a cord that crossed the clearing and held him in place without touching. It became possible to understand individual threads within the mass. The rustle of sleeve against sleeve, the faint grind of twine under tension, the sigh of corn as wind refuses to name itself wind. Underneath those threads, the quiet carried a message that did not arrive as speech so much as orientation. It turned his face toward the place within himself, where a verdict was already written. The maze did not need to accuse. It only needed to name the condition that would continue in the absence of confession. Elliot considered the economy of his past choices, how efficiently he had translated discomfort into duty, duty into silence, silence into survival. He let the arithmetic sit without self-defense, not as self-punishment, but as a refusal to move the numbers to a different column the way he once had. The folded flag under his arm felt heavier now that the air had changed function from atmosphere to audience. Ranger looked up, and in that glance he found permission to set the next moment down with care rather than force, to treat truth as something delicate and exacting rather than large and abstract. He drew a long breath and met the circle with a steadiness that felt earned rather than borrowed. The clearing answered by focusing its sound into a single thread at last. The many made one. The sentence that formed did not need a mouth to carry it. It resolved from friction into clarity, the way frost on glass yields a view when warmth reaches it from within. The message did not break the quiet. It completed it. The maze had been building toward this point, from the first step at the gate, from the first glance at stitches that looked like smiles. The line it delivered was not a demand alone. It was an offer shaped like a threshold. If he crossed it, he would not erase what preceded. He would only refuse to keep repeating it. If he refused it, the field would continue holding him in the posture he had chosen for too many years. The ground trembled with a low, patient shiver, and beneath the straw, a shape began to move with the unmistakable rhythm of breath, something alive preparing to surface and claim its place in the story he would either finally tell or continue to avoid. The soil cracked like a jaw opening for truth. The sound was small, but it carried a dry articulation that made the ground feel sentient beneath Elliot's palms. He lowered his weight without ceremony, knees taking the cold, as if the field had issued a simple instruction and his body had chosen obedience over argument. The maze responded by tightening its geometry. Paths that had seemed generous narrowed into a ring, a quiet arena where light pooled in shallow circles and shadows braided themselves into a perimeter. Nothing pressed him down, yet the atmosphere settled with the gravity of a room where testimony is finally unavoidable. Figures that had been stern and solid a moment earlier softened into thresholds of smoke and light, their edges dissolving until they resembled impressions rather than bodies, postures without mass, silhouettes cataloging a history of choices he could no longer call unintentional. They were not ghosts and not performance. They were reflections of every hour he had selected composure over courage. In their gathered presence, Elliot recognized the architecture of his own restraint, the trained habit of standing straight, the measured gaze that avoids trouble by wearing the look of a man with somewhere else to be, the careful edit of truth he practiced so long it felt like muscle memory. The field did not accuse, it illuminated. Ranger moved into the silence like a declaration of allegiance and began pawing at the dirt with a contained urgency, not frantic, not destructive, but purposeful, as if the ground had offered a task that only trust could complete. Clods lifted and loosened, releasing a vein of objects the color of old water and tarnished air. Metals with their ribbons gone to rags, badges dulled to a serious gray, pins whose edges had grown soft under time's slow insistence. They surfaced one by one in the arc of the dog's work. Elliot noted what connected them before he parsed the details. Names stamped on backs and bars that belonged to men who were never invited to a dais. Commendations that had learned the weight of pockets, but not of ceremony. Each piece was a record of a life given and then misfiled, a ledger page torn clean while the numbers still mattered. The sight reorganized his understanding with the inevitability of a key turning in a lock he had pretended was decorative. He felt how silence had dressed itself in virtuous clothing, discipline, composure, loyalty, until the garments wore thin enough for their seams to show. In that seam work, he saw complicity, not as a monstrous act, but as a practiced omission, the withheld correction, the averted eyes, the gratitude accepted on behalf of a uniform, while the man who had earned it was reduced to a footnote or a rumor. He recognized that this was not a revelation staged for his benefit. It was the maintenance of a truth that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. The field was not punishing him. It was offering accuracy. He brought Holt's dog tag to his palm and held it until the edge taught him the lesson of boundaries. The metal bit into skin with a fine, honest sting, not theatrical, not cruel, simply precise. He pressed harder and felt a bead of blood meet rust, a small joining of present to past that refused metaphor because the material made it literal. The moment was intimate rather than dramatic. It belonged to no audience. It was the sort of mark a craftsman accepts without complaint when the work requires close contact with something unyielding. He welcomed the certainty of it. The clarity pain can sometimes provide when it remains modest and exact. The air cooled with the gentleness of a library door opening. The whisper that had filled the maze lost its edge and settled into patience, a recalibration that shifted the room from cross-examination to invitation. The wind no longer tried to sound like a verdict. It sounded like waiting, the spacious waiting of a teacher who knows the answer has already formed and will arrive when pride has set down its last defense. The circle of paths did not widen, yet the room within Elliot expanded enough to contain what needed to be said without flooding him. He realized that the field's intelligence was not theatrical, but procedural. It had arranged a sequence and trusted the sequence to do what spectacle could not. He let the chain of his own tag touch Holt's, metal to metal, and felt how two weights can balance in a way one weight never will. The thought that rose was simple. Silence had never been loyalty. It had been preference disguised as duty. The lesson did not accuse him of malice. It asked him to call his comforts what they were, advantages that cost other men recognition, while he accepted its interest. He allowed the statement to exist without revisions, without the apology that tries to recenter the apologizer. In the quiet of that acceptance, something long and inward relaxed, as if a muscle held taut since the first report had at last been permitted to unclench. Ranger stopped digging and leaned against his thigh, the contact direct and elemental. Elliot placed his free hand on the dog's neck and felt the steadiness there, the uncomplicated pact that had tethered him to breath on nights when breath felt optional. Loyalty does not negotiate its terms. It attends, and in attending it persuades a man to meet himself without spectacle. He kept his gaze forward, honor the perimeter's attention, and let the facts inside him shape a sentence that did not require a mouth. He acknowledged that Holt's courage had exceeded his own, not as an indictment of his worth, but as a calibration of his history. Holt had crossed lines Elliot had drawn and then obeyed, and that difference had quietly governed every room Elliot entered afterward. The field received the admission the way a harbor receives a tide, without applause, without advice, only by making space for arrival. Light adjusted in increments, shifting from a red patience to a paler, workmanlike gold. The Scarecrow shapes held their softened edges, no longer demanding posture, simply maintaining presence the way witnesses do when the testimony has finally met the moment it belongs to. The smell of straw shed its hint of smoke and found its ordinary sweetness again, and the air warmed at the forearms while remaining cool at the neck, as if to remind the body it could inhabit more than one temperature of truth at once. He noticed then that the ground had ceased its small tremor. The soil settled into composure, the way a chest does after a long-held breath. He remained on his knees, not from defeat, but from respect, unwilling to rise before the room dismissed him. In that posture, he recognized the difference between being humbled and being humiliated. The first makes a man usable. The second makes him small. The field preferred usefulness. It had gathered him not to break him, but to bring him into alignment with a story that did not need him to function, yet wanted him to belong to it honestly. From the ring's far edge, straw lifted with the economy of movement that belongs to things certain of their purpose. It rose not in a rush, but in a deliberate assembling, threads gathering into limb and shoulder until an outline formed that the eye could understand without ornament, a frame that knew his name because it had once said it when names mattered most. The figure stood within the refinement of light and did not approach. It did not ask. It did not accuse. It did not bless. It held its ground with the balance of a man who has earned the right to wait for acknowledgment and nothing less. A figure rose slowly from the straw, Holt's outline, not alive, not dead, simply waiting for acknowledgment. The dead man didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for truth. Holt's outline held still in the softened light, formed from the same straw and dusk that shaped the maze, yet resolved with the certainty of a presence that didn't need to explain itself. Not mercy, not reproach, simply steadiness, the kind that redirected the room without raising a hand. Elliot felt the space adjust around them, the air rewriting its own weight, and knew that the next part of this story would not be about what he wanted to remember, but about what he was finally willing to admit. The field loosened its grip on night. Pale color bled along the corn's edges, reassuring but not yet gentle, like a dawn rehearsal that refused to become spectacle until a final word was spoken. The scarecrows along the ring stood at their posts with the patience of long practice, their stitched faces angled toward the center, each one holding a posture that read as attention rather than hunger. Ranger lay at Elliot's side, chest touching his thigh, eyes clear, the living witness that the maze seemed to require. The dog's nearness steadied breath into a rhythm that could carry words, even if the words would never cross his lips. Confession does not always need a voice. Sometimes it asks only for a man to withdraw his last defense and set the unsaid where everyone can see it. He traced the memory without ornament, refusing the temptation to reshape it into something he could admire. He remembered the night that decided his story, the angle of a road under pale fire, the instinct that had turned his body, the hand that had reached his collar and hauled him into a new trajectory. He remembered what came after, the write-up that gathered facts into a form acceptable to rooms that prized clean endings, and the quiet that followed him home, where clean endings were treated as proof rather than convenience. He had let that quiet do his work. It had stroked his reputation into something smooth and manageable, while the rough truth sunk below the surface, where no one would trip over it. That smoothness had not been free. It had been financed by the absence of Holt's name at tables where the living were honored. He understood that the maze had not demanded he relive the harm. It had instead demanded that he name his place inside its aftermath. There was no spectacle here, only accounting. The dog tags lay on his palm, both chilled by air and warmed by skin, small units of testimony that weighed far more than their shape. He watched them a long moment and then threaded chain over chain, metal looping metal until the two lengths held each other. He pressed the tags flat against his sternum and applied the steady pressure of hands that had learned to fix what could be mended. The edges bit and warmed and finally gave, not by miracle, but by force, their corners kissing into a shallow bend that joined them. Two names were now carried by one chain. It was not alchemy. It was intention made. Visible, the scarecrows bowed as if a current had passed through their frames, a controlled acceptance that felt like the final movement of a ritual rather than applause for a performance. Heads lowered by degrees, then held, and in their bending, Elliot felt how long the field had been prepared for this small correction. Holt's outline did not shift, did not soften, did not move to greet or chastise. Presence remained presence, asking only that the record be set where it belonged. Elliot experienced relief, not as release, but as alignment. The parts of him that had tried to live separately, soldier, son of a town, witness to an omission, fell into a single column that could finally bear the sum without splitting. The maze breathed, a wide exhale that moved through the stalks and settled their long whisper into something nearer to quiet. The air shed its metallic tang and found ordinary sweetness again, the scent of dry leaves and work soil after a night where both had been asked to hold more than their share. Light answered in kind, brightening without glare, creating the kind of visibility people mean when they say they can see clearly now. Nothing vanished. The night remained in the texture of the scene, the way a scar remains in skin, not erased, but integrated, proof that healing is not a return to what was before, only a competent continuation. He let his gaze meet the outlines and held it without pleading. There was no bargain to offer and no bargain requested. He gave Holt what he had to give, the admission that the story of his survival had been incomplete, that a portion of its honor had been misapplied, and that from this point on he would refuse the convenience of omission, even when omission might make a room easier to stand in. He promised nothing dramatic, only accuracy, and understood that accuracy could be a form of devotion, a kind of daily service that keeps the record honest. Ranger shifted and rested his head on Elliot's boot, the gesture spare and exact, as if to underscore that loyalty's truest expression is not defense, but attentiveness. The field received this without changing its mind. That was the measure of its integrity. It had not convened to produce a sensation. It had convened to correct a ledger. In that correction, it offered no absolution, and therefore spared him the smaller trap of being cleared. Instead, it extended belonging. The sensation arrived simply, like a door that had always been there swinging open once the correct pressure found the hinge. He realized he did not have to carry the night alone anymore. He only had to carry it accurately, with the people and places it belonged to, named in their proper places. The knowledge did not lighten him so much as it made him bearable to himself. Wind slid through the rows and carried a faint whisper that was not anger, not even warning, but release, the soft phrase a teacher uses to dismiss a class when the lesson has been learned well enough to take home. The Scarecrows raised their heads to their neutral angle. Holt's outline thinned at the edges until it matched the light instead of resisting it, present without insisting. Elliot pushed to his feet without rush, moving the way a man stands in church when the music calls for it, not out of obligation, but out of alignment with the room. Ranger stood as well and shook the field from his coat, then steadied, eyes on the corridor beyond the clearing. A band of brightness widened through the corn, not sudden, not showy, only precise, opening the last lane in a way that invited a choice rather than commanded a march. Elliot felt the difference down to bone. He would not be pushed out of this place. He would be permitted to leave it correctly. He gathered the fused tags into his palm and touched them once to his chest, to remind himself that the name he carried was twofold now and should be spoken as such when the speaking mattered. The field waited in the particular stillness of someone who intends to listen to the next thing you say when you return. He turned toward the new light and set his shoulders to it, ready to learn how daylight would handle what night had revealed. Light broke through the final row of corn, but something beyond it waited, unmoving, as if to see whether he would step through. By dawn, the fairgrounds were empty, as though the night had erased everyone but him. The light arrived in careful increments, not with spectacle, but with intention, lifting the darkness from the edges of the corn and laying it flat on the soil like a folded coat. Elliot stepped out of the field as if crossing a border he had not known he'd been living behind. His clothes were torn where the maze had insisted on contact. Dust clung to his sleeves and collar, as though the field wanted to leave its mark. His eyes were hollow with the cost of watching, and steady with the relief of having watched honestly. Ranger followed a pace behind, favoring a foreleg, his fur streaked with ash and seed husk, the kind of residue that proves a place was real, even after it begins to feel like a memory. The world outside held its breath. Tents stood as light skeletons, stakes still gripping the earth, ropes gone slack. Prize jars sat on tabletops with no hands to claim them, labels curling at the corners. Banners sagged mid-slogan, their fabric caught in a quiet that felt curated rather than accidental. It was not abandonment so much as a pause, a necessary emptying of space after something large has finished speaking. The air no longer tasted of smoke. It carried the thin sweetness of morning and the mineral clarity of ground that has remembered what it's for. Elliot moved through this vacancy with the care of someone placing objects back where they belong, even if those objects were only steps, breath, and attention. He did not look back at the entrance. He did not need to. The body knows when a threshold has completed its instruction. The road toward thee. Cemetery unspooled along the edge of Hollow Creek with the modesty of a path that has learned not to demand ceremony. Fence posts banded with rust-marked distance without counting it. Live oaks leaned slightly toward the water, as if listening for a story they had been told 1,000 times and were willing to hear again. Sun rose behind him, quiet and sure, sending a new layer of light across the field until the corn shone the color of polished brass. Ranger's gait settled into something even, a compromise between endurance and care, the dog's presence shaping silence into company rather than isolation. Holt's grave waited at the far corner of the cemetery, beneath an oak that knew how to make shade generous. The marker was plain wood and unpolished stone, both softened by weather, both honest to the task. No wreath, no etched declarations, just a name and the dates that do the simple arithmetic of a life without explaining the cost. Elliot stopped a few feet short and let the place introduce itself again, the way one does when re-entering a room that deserves a pause. The grass here was shorter, as if wind had chosen to do a bit of trimming in the night. The soil carried the faint scent of rain that hadn't fallen, a promise the day had decided to keep in another form. He knelt and opened his palm. The fused tags lay there, the seam between them no longer sharp, just a careful ridge that marked where two stories had agreed to share a chain. He pressed them into the earth, not with haste, not with hesitation, but with the steady pressure of a man closing a ledger correctly. His palm stayed a moment longer, anchoring weight into ground that had once divided and now accepted without condition. The gesture carried no speech, only a transfer. Here is what was misplaced. Here is where it belongs. The field, even at this distance, felt nearer for it, as if the maze's center had learned how to extend itself when treated with accuracy. Ranger eased down beside the grave, front paws crossed, eyes half closed in the kind of rest that is really a vigil. His chest rose and fell in a measured rhythm that found Elliot's breath and matched it, a metronome shared between species who have learned to lean on one another's steadiness. The dog's presence was not theatrical comfort. It was evidence that loyalty can live beyond usefulness, that staying can be its own kind of courage, that watching with someone can change the character of what is watched. Elliot placed his hand on the dog's shoulder and felt the calm there, a reminder that the living often carry the dead best, not by grief alone, but by reliability. The town sounds returned in slim threads along the road, a truck door closing, a kettle clanged against a sink, a distant radio testing a morning station. Life has a way of returning itself to service after long nights, but the shape of that life alters when truth has been set in its correct place. Elliot rose slowly and swept, soil from his knees, eyes refocusing through tears that did not need wiping to be acknowledged. He looked up through oak branches at the slice of sky that had turned the color of clean porcelain and let the image fix itself. The grave, the tags beneath, the dog at rest, the field beyond brightening into a promise neither simple nor extravagant, only faithful. When he turned toward the fairgrounds, the maze no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a system that had performed the function it was designed for once someone had chosen to use it honestly. The rows gleamed in the morning, not with shine, but with readiness. If the night had been a courtroom, the day was a workshop, the kind of light in which records are set straight and hands get on with the tasks that follow. He understood that no parade, no proclamation, no sudden ceremony would correct what history had sorted into the wrong drawers. Precision would, repetition would, the telling and retelling would. He could carry that. He would carry it. As he reached the edge of the fairgrounds, the breeze gathered itself into a long sweep across the corn and pulled a hush through the stalks, not erasing the previous night's echoes, but arranging them into a pattern legible at last. The field shimmered in the morning light, golden and still, at peace, in the way a place is when it has been listened to properly. It remained haunted only in the sense that memory does not evaporate once it has finally learned where to live. Elliot placed his hand briefly against the fence post, as if touching a shoulder before leaving a room, and felt the wood's answer, firm, finished, ready. The camera drifts back to the maze. One scarecrow remains standing, its straw hand raised in salute, the wind carrying a single word through the corn. Remember, if stories like this remind you the silence has its own cost, let this one stay with you a little longer. Share it with someone who still believes truth can heal more than it hurts. And if you felt something in Elliot's final choice, ask yourself this: would you have stepped into the maze or walked away?